Welcome to SKC, Sapna Kohli classes. Today, we'll do lesson number 1 from the book Footprints Without Feet. The name of the lesson is A Triumph of Surgery by James Herriot. A Triumph of Surgery is a story about a small dog, Tricky, who is pampered and overfed by his rich mistress. He falls seriously ill, and his mistress consults a veterinary surgeon. Does he perform an operation? Does the dog recover? Let us read the lesson. I was really worried about Tricky this time. I is the narrator, James Herriot. I was really worried about Tricky this time. I had pulled up my car when I saw him in the street with his mistress, and I was shocked at his appearance. So, the narrator Mr. Herriot was worried when he saw Tricky. He stopped. Pulled up means he stopped his car when he saw him. Him refers to Tricky in the street with his mistress. And he was shocked at the appearance of the dog. He had become hugely fat. Hugely means extremely fat, like a bloated sausage with a leg at each corner. Now, what is the meaning of a bloated sausage? Now, bloated sausage, it means that Tricky had become very fat, extremely fat, and bloated means swollen. And sausage means finely minced meat stuffed into long cylindrical cases and divided into small lengths by twisting or tying. So this is the meaning of bloated sausage. And in simple language, you can say that Tricky had become very huge in size with a leg at each corner. His eyes bloodshot. Bloodshot means red, and rheumy. Rheumy means watery. Rheumy means watery. Stared straight ahead, and his tongue lolled from his jaws. So Tricky's eyes, they were bloodshot. Tricky's eyes were red and rheumy. They were wet, and he stared. Stared means to look intently. Straight ahead. Ahead means in front, forward. And his tongue lolled from his jaws. So his tongue was coming out, it was hanging from his jaws. Mrs. Pumphrey hastened. Hasten means to hurry up. Hastened to explain. He was so listless, Mr. Herriot. He seemed to have no energy. So Mrs. Pumphrey hastened very quickly. She went to explain Mr. Herriot that he was so listless. He refers to the dog. Listless means lifeless. Mr. Herriot, so she said that my dog is lifeless. He seemed to have no energy. He is lacking in energy. I thought he must be suffering from malnutrition. Malnutrition means lack of good diet. So I have been giving him some little extras between meals to build him up, some malt and cod liver oil, and a bowl of Horlicks at night to make him sleep. Nothing much really. So Mrs. Pumphrey was worried about her dog, as her dog had grown quite fat and listless, right? And she thought that her dog was suffering from malnutrition. So in order to make up for that, she started giving him extras between the regular meals, and she used to give him some malt. Malt is grain which is soaked in water, and cod liver oil. Cod liver oil means oil of fish, and a bowl of Horlicks at night. And did you cut down on the sweet things as I told you? So Mr. Harriet asked Mrs. Pumphrey if she had stopped giving him sweets uh, as he had suggested her. Oh, I did for a bit, but he seemed to be so weak, I had to relent. Now, the meaning of relent is to soften, or you can say here to give up. She said, initially, I did not give him sweets, but then he seemed to be so weak that I had to give up, and I again started giving him sweet things. He does love cream cakes and chocolates, so I can't bear to refuse him. My dog loves cream cakes and chocolates, so I cannot refuse him. Bear means to tolerate. I cannot say no to him. I looked down again at the little dog. That was the trouble. Tricky's only fault was greed. He had never been known to refuse food. He would tackle a meal at any hour of the day or night. And I wondered about all the things Mrs. Pumphrey hadn't mentioned. So Mr. Harriet says that Tricky's only fault was that he was very greedy. He never said no to food, and he would tackle. Tackle here means he would handle a meal at any hour, any time of the day or night. And I wondered and I thought about all the other things Mrs. Pumphrey must be giving him, which she hadn't mentioned. Are you giving him plenty of exercise? Asked Mr. Harriet. So, Mr. Harriet asked Mrs. Pumphrey if she was giving Tricky enough exercise. Well, he has his little walks with me, as you can see, but Hodgkin, the gardener, has been down with lumbago, so there has been no ring throwing lately. So Mrs. Pumphrey replied that she had been taking her dog for little walks every day, but Hodgkin, their gardener, has been down with lumbago. Lumbago is pain in muscles or joints of lower back. So she says that my gardener Hodgkin is suffering from muscular and joint pain. So there has been no ring throwing lately. So this thing has not been done with the dog used to every day play with the gardener this ring game. So this has not been done since the gardener is not keeping well. I tried to sound severe. Severe here means harsh or strict. Now, I really mean this. If you don't cut his food right down and give him more exercise, he is going to be really ill. So, Mr. Harriet, in a very strict and harsh tone, told Mrs. Pumphrey that if she would not cut his food immediately, and if she would not give his dog more exercise, he is going to be really very ill. You must harden your heart and keep him on a very strict diet. So you must harden your heart. So you have to be, if you love your dog, you'll have to be very strict with him, right? And you should keep him on a very strict diet. Mrs. Pumphrey wrung her hands. Now, wrung means she twisted her hands. Oh, I will, Mr. Harriet. I am sure you are right, but it is so difficult, so very difficult. So she told Mr. Harriet that she is going to follow his advice, but I'm sure you are right that, and she agreed with Mr. Harriet. But then she said that it was very difficult for her to do all that since she loved her dog very much. She set off ahead down, set off. Now, set off means set off. Set off means started. She set off head down along the road. She started walking along the road with her head down, as if determined to put the new regime into practice immediately. Now, determined means she looked as if she was firm to put the regime. Regime means the new order, the new rule regarding food into practice immediately. With her head down, she started walking along the road, and it appeared as if she had decided that she is going to follow the new rule regarding the food to be given to Tricky immediately. I watched their progress with growing concern. So, as they were walking, Mr. Harriet was looking at them with concern, worry. Tricky was tottering along. Now, the what is the meaning of the word tottering? Tricky was staggering. Tottering means staggering along in his little tweed coat. Tweed is it is a woolen material which is very soft. So Tricky was wearing a tweed coat. He had a whole wardrobe of these coats. Wardrobe means a cupboard of these coats. Tricky had a variety of coats for the cold weather and a raincoat for the wet days. He struggled on, drooping his harness. Now, drooping in his harness. Tricky struggled on the road. It was very difficult for Tricky to walk on the road, and he was drooping. He was hanging in his harness. Harness is the leather strap. I thought it wouldn't be long before I heard from Mrs. Pumphrey. Seeing the condition of Tricky, Mr. Harriet was sure that soon he is going to get a call from Mrs. Pumphrey about Tricky's health. The expected call came within a few days. As Mr. Harriet had expected, a few days later, Mrs. Pumphrey called him up. Mrs. Pumphrey was distraught. Distraught means upset. Mrs. Pumphrey was upset. Now, why was she upset? Tricky would eat nothing. Tricky was not eating anything. He spent all his time lying on a rug panting. So, all the time, Tricky was lying. He was lying on a rug. Rug is a floor covering, and he was panting. Now, panting means breathing with difficulty. Tricky would eat nothing. Tricky had stopped eating anything, refused even his favorite dishes, and besides, he had bouts of vomiting. So, so the meaning of these lines is that Tricky had lost his appetite. He often vomited, and he used to lie down motionless on the carpet, and it was very difficult for him to even breathe. Didn't want to go for walks, didn't want to do anything. I had made my plans in advance. So Mr. Harriet had already made plans about the treatment that he is going to give to Tricky in advance. The only way was to get Tricky out of the house for a period. So the only way to cure Tricky was to take him out of Mrs. Pumphrey's house for some time. I suggested that he be hospitalized for about a fortnight. Fortnight is a period of 2 weeks to be kept under observation. So Mr. Harriet told Mrs. Pumphrey that the dog had to be hospitalized for a fortnight. Now, what happened to Mrs. Pumphrey when she heard about the hospitalization of the dog? The poor lady almost swooned. Swooned means fainted. She was sure he would pine and die if he did not see her every day. Now, Mrs. Pumphrey was about to faint when she heard that Tricky would be hospitalized, and She was sure he would pine and die. Now, what is the meaning of this word pine and die? Pine and die means to be very sad because you want to be with someone you love. So she said that even her dog would would be very sad, and it would be very difficult for her dog to stay away from her if he did not see her every day. But I took a firm line. But Mr. Harriet was firm on his decision. Tricky was very ill, and this was the only way to save him. In fact, I thought it is best to take him without delay, and followed by Mrs. Pumphrey's wailings, I marched out to the car carrying the little dog wrapped in a blanket. So Mr. Harriet was firm on his decision that the dog need to be hospitalized, and that was the only way to save him. And he thought that it would be better if, without any delay, without wasting any time, he took Tricky to his home, and followed by Mrs. Pumphrey's wailings. So Mrs. Pumphrey was moaning, or wailing means moaning, or you can say she was crying. I marched out to the car carrying the little dog wrapped. Wrapped means covered in a blanket. So Mr. Harriet took Tricky in his car. The entire staff was roused, and maids rushed in and out, bringing his day bed, his night bed, favorite cushions, toys, and rubber rings, breakfast bowl, lunch bowl, supper bowl. So the entire staff, the whole staff of Mrs. Pumphrey was roused. Roused here means stood up, and maids rushed in and out, bringing his day bed, night bed, favorite cushions, toys, rubber rings, breakfast bowl, lunch bowl, supper bowl, used by Tricky. Realizing that my car would never hold all the stuff, I started to drive away. He said that I knew that my car would not hold all these, all the stuff that was being brought by the maids and the staff of Mrs. Pumphrey. So I started to drive away. As I moved off, Mrs. Pumphrey, with a despairing means disappointing, full of disappointment, despairing cry, threw an armful of the little coats through the window. So he said that as he started to drive away, Mrs. Pumphrey, with a despairing cry, she threw an armful of uh, little coats through the window of the car. I looked in the mirror before I turned the corner of the drive. Everybody was in tears. So before I turned, I saw that everybody was in tears. Out on the road, I glanced down. Glanced means looked down at the pathetic. Pathetic means pitiable. Pathetic means pitiable. Little animal gasping on the seat by my side. So, gasping here means panting. Gasping means panting. So, he said that panting, or you can say deep breathing, breathing with difficulty. So, as they reached on the road, I means Mr. Harriet, he looked down at the pathetic little animal. Pathetic means pitiable. Pitiable little animal refers to Tricky, who was gasping, who was breathing, taking deep breaths on the seat beside Mr. Harriet. I patted the head, and Tricky made a brave effort to wag his tail. So Mr. Harriet, he patted the head. He put his hands on the head of the dog. He rubbed his hand on the head of the dog, and Tricky made a brave effort to wag, to move his tail. Poor old lad, I said, You haven't a kick in you, but I think I know a cure for you. So, Mr. Poor old lad refers to Tricky. So, Mr. Pumphrey told the dog, I said, I is Mr. Harriet, you haven't a kick in you. You haven't a kick in you means right now you do not have any energy in you. Right? You do not have a kick in you, but I think I know a cure for you, but I know how to cure you, how to heal you. Cure means to heal you. At the surgery, surgery here refers to the clinic. At the surgery, the household dogs surged round me. So when Mr. Harriet reached his surgery, his clinic with Tricky, the other dogs in the house surged. They came round him. They all gathered around him. Surged means gathered around him. Tricky looked down at the noisy pack with dull eyes. Pack means a group of dogs. So, Tricky looked at the noisy pack with dull eyes and, when put down, lay motionless on the carpet. When Mr. Harriet put him down, he laid down on the carpet still without any movement. The other dogs, after sniffing. Sniffing means smelling, smelling with nose. After sniffing round him for a few seconds, decided he was an uninteresting object and ignored him. So Tricky was not responding. He was just lying motionless. So the other dogs, after sniffing round him, they found him to be uninterested and they ignored him. I made up a bed for him in a warm, loose box next to the one where the other dogs slept. So he made up a bed for him in a warm, loose box to the one where the other dogs slept. For 2 days, I kept an eye on him, giving him no food but plenty of water. For 2 days, Mr. Harriet, he kept Tricky under observation. He did not give him anything to eat. He was just kept on water. Plenty of water was given to him. At the end of the second day, he started to show some interest in his surroundings. And on the third day, he began to whimper. Now, the meaning of whimper is to cry in pain. Or whimper, you can say, is a low sound. When he heard the dogs in the yard, when Tricky heard the sound of the other dogs in the yard, even he whimpered. When I opened the door, Tricky trotted out. Trotted out means here moved out and was immediately engulfed. Now, engulfed, he was immediately engulfed means surrounded by Joe, the greyhound. The greyhound is hunting dog. Joe is the name of the hunting dog. And his friends, after rolling him over and thoroughly inspecting him, the dogs moved down the garden. Tricky followed them, rolling slightly with his surplus fat. Now, what happened was that when I opened the door, when Mr. Harriet opened the door, Tricky trotted out and was immediately surrounded by Joe, the greyhound. Greyhound means the hunting dog, and his friends. After rolling him over, they rolled Tricky and thoroughly inspecting him, the dogs moved off down the garden. They moved towards the garden. Tricky followed them. Rolling slightly with his surplus fat means extra fat. Later that day, I was present at feeding time. So it was time to feed the dogs. So Mr. Harriet was present at that time. I watched while Tristan slopped the food into the bowls. Tristan is the name of a person who was feeding the dogs. And as Tristan slopped, he put the food into the bowls. there was the usual headlong rush followed by the sounds of high speed eating. Every dog knew that if he fell behind the others, he was liable to have some competition for the last part of his meal. So what happened was that at the time of the when the food was being served to the dogs in the bowls, all the dogs they used to rush straight. Headlong means straight. They used to rush towards the bowls, right? And one could hear the sound of their eating. They used to eat at high speed because every dog knew that if he fell behind the others, he was liable. He was liable to have some competition for the last part of his meal. That if the dog he was not able to finish his food, then he was liable. Liable means he was likely to have some competition for the other last part of his meal. The other dogs would rush to have his meal. So that's all for this video. The remaining part of the lesson we will do in part 2 of the lesson, A Triumph of Surgery. If you have liked my video, please don't forget to like, share and subscribe. Thank you.